This story didn't happen to me, but when it was told to me, I didn't doubt its truth for a second. In the summer of 2009, I went to visit my grandmother in the remote mountain town in Appalachia, West Virginia. The kind of place where self-service dies and everyone knows everyone's business. There, through a lucky coincidence, I met a great local girl named Chloe. Chloe had an older brother named Luke. He was built like a brick outhouse, a real mountain man. At first, he glared at me like a wolf, and there were even a few threats, but eventually, we found common ground. Luke turned out to be a normal guy, and one fine day, we agreed to go fishing together at the local lake. The sun was beating down relentlessly. The fish were biting reluctantly, and the mosquitoes were eating us alive. Thank God Luke brought along a cure for the sweltering boredom. A large mason jar of strong homemade local moonshine. We quickly finished it off, the liquid burning our throats. After that, we kind of stopped caring about the fish, and we started chatting about everything. Suddenly, Luke became very serious. His gaze darkened, and he told me a story that happened to him before he ever met me. Luke had a childhood friend named Tommy. The two of them were inseparable back in the day. They often visited abandoned forest cabins miles off the main road, looking for old coins, antique bottles, or copper wire to scrap for cash. One dead of night, fueled by boredom and cheap beer, they decided to explore an old, rotting, uninhabited house that was located deep in the woods. They approached the house and pulled the front door. It was locked. They walked around the house and saw a window that had been ripped out along with its frame. The guys climbed inside through it. Inside the house, the air was thick with dust and the smell of rot. Everything was turned upside down. Dirty, mildewed sheets were scattered across the floor. A rusted iron bed was flipped over, and the heavy wooden table was broken in half. While they were sifting through the trash in the pale beams of their flashlights, they suddenly started hearing some noise from outside. At first, they thought it was a wild dog or a coyote, but they still decided to lay low and turn off the lights. Luke told me that for some reason, at that exact moment, a chilling fear pierced his soul. The noise outside wouldn't stop. In the absolute suffocating silence of the Appalachian night, you could clearly hear thick, dry branches snapping loudly under someone's feet. And suddenly, it dawned on Luke. A dog or a coyote cannot be that heavy. Whatever was walking outside was massive, and it was walking on two legs. The footsteps were slow, heavy, and deliberate, pacing back and forth in front of the porch. At that very moment, Luke became truly terrified. His mouth went completely dry, and his heart started hammering against his ribs. Then Luke noticed his friend. Tommy was standing motionless, staring at a single spot, and his face was completely contorted with unspeakable terror. Luke slowly turned his head at the exact same spot. He froze, staring right at them through the empty, shattered window with the massive god's face. It wasn't just an animal. It was too high off the ground, hunched over broad humanoid shoulders. Its face was pale, covered in filthy, matted fur that reeked of copper and wet earth. But the worst part was the eyes. Human eyes, but with horizontal pupils gleaming with a sickly, intelligent malice. Running out of the house was terrifying because that thing was standing right outside the only exit. They just stood frozen in the dark, trapped, not knowing what to do. Suddenly, the god's face slowly lowered down and disappeared into the shadows. Dead silence fell over the woods. Tommy and Luke continued to stand like statues, afraid to even breathe. About 5 minutes passed. Nothing happened. They nervously started to think that everything was fine and the creature had left. But suddenly, from outside, right next to the closed front door, someone yelled. It was a macabre, distorted voice. It sounded like a vocal cord trying to mimic a human, but it was pitched wrong, vibrating in a demonic register.
Open the door, or it's going to be worse.
Right after those words, something started slamming into the old wooden door. The blows were of such inhuman, explosive strength that the entire cabin shook, dust falling from the ceiling. Tommy went into full hysterics. He dropped his flashlight and started sobbing uncontrollably, covering his ears. After about the third massive blow, the rusted lock gave out. The door violently smashed wide open. Luke didn't wait for that thing to step into the room. Beside himself with primal fear, he sprinted toward the broken window. He vaulted through the splintered frame and landed hard on the muddy ground outside. And in that exact second, he heard a heart-rending, agonizing scream from Tommy echoing out of the pitch-black cabin. A wet, tearing sound followed. At this point of the story, Luke's voice cracked and his hands were shaking so badly he had to put his drink down. I swear tears welled up in his eyes. Luke ran. How he made it home through the dense pitch-black woods, he couldn't remember himself. Branches whipped his face, tearing his skin, but he didn't stop once. He lay in his bed the entire night, paralyzed, without closing his eyes. Morning finally came. Someone knocked aggressively on Luke's door. It was Tommy's mother. She was in panic. She said that her son came home near dawn, barely alive. His hair, which had been dark brown the day before, had turned completely stark white. When asked what happened, he just mumbled incoherently, stared at his hands, and shook violently. She looked Luke dead in the eyes and asked the question, "Do you know what happened to him out there?" And Luke lied. He swallowed his guilt, said he had no idea, and claimed he had basically sat at home alone all night. From that very day, Tommy completely withdrew into his own mind. He stopped talking, stopped eating, and stopped communicating with anyone, including his own mother. He just stared blankly at the wall, rocking back and forth. A week later, he was taken to the psychiatric asylum, and they keep him there to this day, heavily medicated in the locked ward. The only person in the world besides me that Luke ever dared to tell this story to was his sister Chloe. And thank God she was one of those rare girls who knows how to keep a dark secret. I was the second, and most likely the absolute last person Luke told this horrific truth to, because exactly 2 weeks after our conversation on that lake, Luke died in a horrific, fatal motorcycle crash on an empty night highway. They say he swerved off the cliff like he was trying to avoid something standing in the middle of the road. Why he told this story specifically to me, a city guy he had only known for a couple of weeks, I don't know. Probably it was just eating away at his soul. The guilt was gnawing him alive from the inside. He needed to confess it to someone, because if he told his local friends, they would have killed him for abandoning Tommy in that cabin, and the whole town would panic knowing what roams in their woods. Luke knew I was leaving soon and wouldn't tell anyone. To believe in the God-man or not to believe, that is a personal choice for everyone. But looking into Luke's haunted eyes that day, I believed it all. One day, after a long day of wandering through the dense forest, a hunter was caught in the middle of the thicket by a stormy night. It had already gotten dark, freezing rain began to fall, and having no idea of his location, he decided to keep walking in one direction until he made it out of the woods. After several grueling hours of walking, he stumbled into a small clearing, in the middle of which stood a wooden cabin. Realizing he had no chance and could freeze to death, he decided to stay in the cabin for the night. The door was unlocked, and no one was inside. The hunter, exhausted to the bone, lay down on the single creaky bed. Looking around the dark cabin, the hunter was surprised to find that all the walls were decorated with several portraits painted in great, intricate detail. Without exception, all the pale faces in the portraits stared at him maliciously and with clear threat. The hunter felt extremely uncomfortable under their piercing gazes. Ignoring the faces in the paintings that glared at him with hatred, he turned to face the wooden wall, covered himself with his jacket, and quickly fell asleep. The next morning, he woke up to bright sunlight hitting his face. Looking around the bright room, he froze. He saw that there were absolutely no portraits on the walls in the cabin. There were only windows. I was born in 1980 and grew up in a small, dying steel town in Ohio, right in the heart of the Rust Belt. It was a very special, unique time. Everything felt somehow easy and uncomplicated. Everyone knew each other, and the exact same families lived in the exact same houses for decades. I still visit my hometown once a year, and it feels like absolutely nothing has changed there. The same old neighbors, the same cashiers in the local stores that survived. But what I remember most from my childhood is my middle school years. Life in the early 90s was completely different. We didn't have smartphones, social media, or modern consoles. We spent our days outside, riding our bikes until the streetlights came on. It was a glorious, carefree time, but it was also when I had the most terrifying experience of my entire life. It was the first and hopefully the absolute last time I ever encountered the supernatural, and I still cannot forget it, even after all these years. I was in the 7th grade, making me about 12 years old. As always, my group of friends and I were hanging out late. It was around 10:30 at night. We were sitting in the dark alleyway, swapping urban legends and ghost stories. Teenage arrogance was in full swing, and my youthful maximalism made me want to prove that I wasn't afraid of anything. Not far from our neighborhood stood an old, partially condemned school building. It looked incredibly menacing in the dark. The dare was simple but terrifying. Break in through the front entrance, sneak past the night watchman, run up to the 3rd floor, open a specific window, and look out at the courtyard. It had to be done in pitch-black darkness, because I absolutely hated feeling weak or giving the other guys a reason to doubt my courage. I foolishly volunteered to do it. As soon as I agreed to the dare, I instantly felt my status rise among the guys. We had 7 people in our group. Riding that massive wave of adrenaline and superiority, I walked to the old school. Standing on the crumbling concrete porch, I peeked through the dirty glass. The night watchman was fall asleep at his desk, his heavy breathing audible even through the thick door. I carefully pulled the door open and slipped into the dusty lobby. I crawled on my stomach right past the guard, slipped behind the concrete pillar, and got to my feet. My friends were supposed to wait outside in the courtyard by the window. I was now on the 1st floor, in total, suffocating darkness without a flashlight. I blindly felt my way along the cold metal lockers to the stairwell. I moved agonizingly slowly, One wrong step and I could fall because it was so dark you couldn't see your own hand. It took me 10 minutes to creep up to the second floor and another 10 to reach the third. As soon as my foot hit the landing of the third floor, my heart stopped. I heard a voice echoing loudly from the very bottom of the stairwell. It was one of my best friends yelling frantically, "Run away, quick! Run back down!" Deep anxiety hit my chest. But just as I turned around to head back down, I heard another shout coming from the courtyard, right outside the open window. It was the exact same friend who had just called me from the stairs. He screamed, "Don't go anywhere! Stand perfectly still and don't move!" I wasn't just scared anymore. I was absolutely paralyzed with a visceral dread. Then, from the dark stairwell below me, the first voice yelled again, "Hurry up and run down! I'm right here! Don't listen to anyone!" I froze, completely immobilized, hot tears streaming down my face. I didn't know what to do, who to believe, or where to run. The voice from the stairwell screamed again, but now it sounded like a bizarre chorus of several guys from my group speaking at once. "There is nobody in the courtyard. We're all standing down here. Do not go to the window. We're coming up." Suddenly, an unnatural, guttural roar echoed through the entire building, and the voices from the stairs shouted in perfect unison, "Run!" I screamed hysterically and blindly sprinted down the dark hallway, completely ignoring the window. Heavy thudding inhuman footsteps were rushing up the stairs right behind me. "Don't go to the window! Don't go forward!" The mimicking voices from the stairs shrieked. At the exact same time, a voice from the open window roared, "Jump!" I hit a dead end in the hallway. The things from the downstairs were rushing up, and I was crying and screaming, trapped in the nightmare. Suddenly, my frantically searching hand brushed against a cold metal doorknob at the very end of the corridor. I yanked the heavy door open, slipped inside, and slammed it shut behind me. I found myself in a cramped utility closet. There was a metal ladder attached to the wall leading up to the roof hatch. Without a single second of hesitation, I scrambled up the rungs, pushed the heavy iron hatch open, and crawled out onto the flat, gravel-covered roof. My heart almost stopped beating entirely. Sitting right there on the roof, huddled together, was my entire group of friends. I screamed in terror, "Don't come near me!" One of my friends rushed over, pushed me hard in the shoulder and hissed, "Are you a complete idiot? We climbed up here using the rusted fire escape. The very second we heard someone calling your name inside the school." I stared at him in absolute shock, my mind completely breaking down. "Wait," I whispered, my voice trembling. "Then who was standing by the window down there?" "We didn't even make it to the window," he replied, shaking like a leaf. "We were walking behind the school, and then we heard our own voices coming from the dark courtyard, and we got terrified." The voices inside the school had gone completely silent, but we were way too terrified to even peek over the edge of the roof. We sat up there shivering until 7 in the morning, until the bright sun came up and the normal people started walking on the streets below. We climbed down the fire escape and never spoke of that horrific story out loud again. But I will remember that terrifying night for the rest of my life. I've always had a passion for urban exploration. I've crawled through almost every rotten factory and boarded up hospital within a 100-mile radius of my city. I even went to Centralia, Pennsylvania, the infamous ghost town where a coal mine fire had been burning underground for decades. I stood with the smoking earth behind me, and it was the greatest feeling of my life. I loved the adrenaline, but true primal terror didn't catch up with me in a famous ghost town. It found me right where my obsession began, in the deep woods near my grandmother's house. Every summer, my parents would send me to the grandmother's place in rural Appalachia. That's where I befriended a local kid named Dennis. He was the one who got me hooked on exploring. We used to crawl through old Cold War fallout shelters and abandoned mine shafts. About a month ago, Dennis texted me. He found something special, an untouched 1970s religious summer camp hidden deep in the valley, completely forgotten by civilization. I took a few days off work, packed my gear, and drove out to meet him. When we forced our way through the overgrown gates of the complex, I realized Dennis wasn't exaggerating. It was a time capsule. A massive gymnasium consumed by black mold, classrooms with rotting chalkboards, yellowed motivational posters still clinging to the walls, and workbooks scattered across the floor. Frost covered the shattered windows, and the air was thick with the smell of decay and asbestos. I took a ton of amazing photos that day. I was thrilled. The best part of URBEX is forcing open doors that have been locked for decades. On the second day, we found the basement of the main building. We used bolt cutters to snap a rusted padlock. Down there, we found old medical supply crates full of expired morphine and strange 1970s pharmaceuticals. I stuffed a whole bag full of souvenirs. Before leaving, we decided to check the indoor pool wing. The pool was drained, lined with cracked white tiles. Above the deep end hung an old faded banner. "Yours is the future." I wanted to take a cool selfie with it. When I pushed open the peeling blue door leading to the pool, my breath hitched. Hanging right over the empty concrete pit was the corpse of a young woman. She was suspended against the backdrop of that faded banner. At first, I was startled, but I didn't panic. In places like this, you occasionally stumble across victims of crime or drifters, but as we got closer, things got very weird. Around her neck was a heavy metal collar. Attached to it was a thick, rusted chain. The chain was straight up, hooked onto a steel beam on the ceiling, 4 stories high, right where a massive spotlight used to hang. This wasn't here yesterday when we scouted the outside of the building. I just couldn't fathom how it was physically possible. How could anyone without a massive extension ladder climb 4 stories up and secure a heavy black chain over a drop like that? But in that moment, logic turned off. My inner photographer took over. The girl looked young, with long pitch black hair. I pulled out my camera, intending to take a picture that would freeze the blood in your veins. I raised the lens, and in that exact moment, the chain snapped. The corpse plummeted to the bottom of the pool. The sound was sickening. A wet slap followed by a loud crunch of breaking bones that echoed off the tiled walls. You have no idea how terrifying it was. Dennis, who had been timidly standing off to the side, suddenly dropped to his knees at the edge of the pool and started crying. He was sobbing loudly, his face buried in his hands. And me, I don't know what came over me. Something pulled me downward. I climbed down the ladder into the empty pool and walked toward her. Her broken body lay on the filthy, shattered tile. Her face was surprisingly beautiful, untouched by decay. I stared at her for a few seconds, and suddenly, my heart stopped. Her toe twitched. I jumped back. Seeing this, Dennis up above started sobbing even harder, almost hysterically. I sprinted toward the blue door we had come through and started yanking the handle. It wouldn't open. It was jammed shut. I turned around and froze. The corpse was standing up, her bones crunched, her joints bending at unnatural, contoured angles as she slowly pushed herself to her feet. She turned and walked to the edge of the deep end, looking up at Dennis. He stopped crying. He was kneeling, staring right back at her. "Dennis! Dennis!" I screamed at the top of my lungs. "Get away from her!" But he didn't even turn around. They just stood face to face, separated only by the drop of the pool. The absurdity of the situation was driving me insane. This is a prank, I thought. It is some sick joke to scare me. I exhaled in relief. You guys are crazy, you idiots. I almost died on a heart attack. Dennis didn't answer. He reached out and slowly, gently tucked a stray strand of hair behind the corpse's ear. "She is unique," he said. His voice was completely hollow, hypnotized. In that moment, I knew this wasn't a prank. I had to run. I dashed toward a broken window on the second level of the gym. I threw my bag of mats through it and tried to jump up to grab the seal. I couldn't reach it. I was shaking so violently with fear, I thought my heart would give out. And then I heard the wet slaps of bare feet on the tiles. They were getting closer to me. I turned around. The corpse was walking straight toward me. And now I saw that it wasn't even human. Her face was no longer pretty. It was twisted into a monstrous, grotesque grimace. Her jaw hung slack, and her dead, glassy eyes stared right through me. She tilted her head to the side at an impossible angle, as if studying me with curiosity. And then Dennis spoke again, in that same dead voice. "She wants to be friends. She's nice." The pure panic gave me strength. I spotted some old wall bars bolted to the concrete. I scrambled up them and lunged for the window. My hands gripped the wooden frame. A jagged piece of glass sliced deep into my right palm. Warm blood sprayed across the wall. I didn't feel the pain. I hauled myself over the sill and plummeted to the ground outside, smashing my chin against the concrete. I grabbed my bag and bolted to my mountain bike, pedaling frantically until my lungs were on fire. My grandmother was in shock when I burst through the door, covered in blood, my face smashed, sobbing hysterically. As soon as I could breathe, I begged her to call the state police to the camp anonymously. I didn't even pack my things. I just grabbed my bag and paid the guy I knew $100 to drive me to the Greyhound station. I got on a bus, crossed state lines, and now I'm hiding at home. My hand is wrapped in bandages and I can't sleep. I keep refreshing the local news on my phone. I wonder if the police found Dennis by that empty pool, and if they did, is he still alive? It is rumored that after midnight, the world changes. The boundaries between reality and something else become thin. This story happened a year ago. My best friend Leo and I were celebrating his 16th birthday. We spent the whole day in the city. Pizza, arcades, movie. Time flew by. We lived out in the suburbs, 100 miles away from the city, and we had to catch the last train home. We sprinted onto the platform of the central station at 5 minutes to midnight. The station was almost completely empty, just the echo of our footsteps bouncing off the marble walls. The digital board glowed with our train, Route 113, departure at 12 a.m. The train was already waiting at the platform. It was an old, weathered commuter train. The doors hissed open and we stepped inside. We collapsed into the seats, our faces happy but exhausted. There were a couple of minutes left before departure and I looked around. The car looked normal, but something felt off. The fluorescent lighting was too bright, almost sterile, like a hospital. It had a low, monotonous humming sound. Right above the door, there was a metal plate with a stamped number, Car 113. Besides Leo and me, there were only 2 other people in the car. They were sitting near the very front, an elderly man in an old gray coat and a middle-aged woman sitting next to him. I noticed them because they were sitting unnaturally straight. They weren't reading newspapers or looking at their phones. They were just staring straight ahead at the empty wall. In all of the time we waited for departure, I didn't see them blink or shift their weight once. There was a strange coldness radiating from them, but I just brushed it off, blaming my own exhaustion. At exactly midnight, the doors slid shut. The train lurched forward and glided smoothly into the night. 10 minutes later, we left the city limits behind. The lights of the buildings vanished from the windows, replaced by the solid, impenetrable blackness of the woods. Occasionally, a lonely street lamp would zip past, casting long, dancing shadows through the cabin. At that moment, the harsh light in the car suddenly flickered and shifted into a soft, dim glow. The monotonous clacking of the wheels over the tracks was hypnotic. Leo had already closed his eyes, leaning his head against the cold glass. I tried to fight off the sleep, but my eyelids felt like lead. The quiet hum of the train swallowed me whole, and I drifted off. I woke up to someone shaking my shoulder. Hey, wake up. Our stop is next." Leo's voice sounded muffled. I rubbed my eyes, feeling deeply disoriented. The train car was completely silent. Too silent. The man and the woman at the front were sitting in the exact same positions. I looked down at my wristwatch and I was stunned. It was 2 a.m. "Already?" I asked, confused. The trip usually took an hour and a half, but 2 full hours had passed. The train started to slow down. We were pulling into the second to last station before our town. The train screeched to a halt at the platform. The doors slid open. Freezing damp air rushed into the cabin. The train always waited at the station for 5 minutes to let a freight train pass. "I'm gonna step out for a minute, get some fresh air," I told Leo. He just nodded, staring blankly at the floor. I stepped down onto the concrete platform. The station was blanketed in the thick, heavy fog. A few dim yellow lights barely pierced through the mist. It was absolutely desolate. No station master, no cars in a parking lot, just a dead silence that made my ears ring. I stood by the front door of the train car, taking deep breaths of the cold air, and then a strange detail caught my eye. On the opposite side of the tracks, standing in deep shadow, was a figure. It was a tall silhouette of the man, and he was doing something weird. He was slowly, almost unnaturally, waving his hand at me. Curiosity overpowered my fear. I took a few steps forward, squinting through the fog, trying to make out his face. The closer I got, the more my stomach tied itself into knots. Suddenly, the man stopped waving. He lowered his arm, and then he started to laugh. It wasn't a normal laugh. It was a dry, grating sound, like metal scraping against metal. An eerie, maniacal laughter that echoed across the empty station. Then, he raised a hand with long, thin fingers and pointed right behind me, at the train. At first, I didn't understand what he meant, but the laughter grew louder, filling my head. In a state of panic, I spun around and I froze in absolute shock. I almost fell to my knees. The train was gone. The massive, multi-ton metal train simply wasn't there. The tracks were completely empty. There was no sound of doors closing, no horn, no clacking of wheels. The train had vanished into the fog in absolute silence, as if it had evaporated into thin air. I spun back around. The silhouette of the laughing man was gone too. I was left completely alone in the freezing void. Panic consumed me. I sprinted toward the old terminal building, pounding on the locked doors, trying to find anyone. Finally, I found the night watchman in a security booth. I hysterically started asking him about Route 113, begging him to contact the dispatcher, screaming that my best friend was still on that train. The watchman looked at me like I was insane. The color drained from his face. What he told me next, I will never forget for the rest of my life. "Son," he said, his voice trembling, "Route 113 isn't running tonight. The tracks are closed." I didn't believe him. I kept yelling. Then he silently reached under his deck, pulled out yesterday's newspaper, and pressed it against the glass of the booth. The massive headline read, "Tragic derailment of Express Route 113. 2 days ago, that exact train had derailed at full speed, plunging off a bridge into a gorge." My eyes scanned the text. My breathing stopped. The article stated that there were no survivors. Among the officially identified fatalities were an elderly man, a middle-aged woman, and a 16-year-old boy named Leo. A year has passed, but I still wake up in a cold sweat. I am tormented by questions that have no answers. How did I even get to that station? If Leo died 2 days prior, who was I walking around the city with all day? And the most terrifying thought of all, who was sitting next to me in the train car? My best friend? Or something else? Something that took his shape to take me with it. And if I hadn't stepped out onto the platform for fresh air, where would the train have finally taken me?